Why would I waste an entire Saturday flying across the country for a coffin that's just going to be lowered into the ground? That callous, perfectly sculpted line. A text from Minerva, my eldest, to her father's phone. Hit me like a physical blow. It was the last message, popping up as I stood alone in the chapel, trying to delete Arthur's contacts with a trembling thumb. The polished wood of the casket reflected the single candle flame I'd lit. Outside, the world was weeping with a cold, November indifference. Yet the chapel was an echo chamber of devastating quiet. Arthur, the anchor of my life, a man who built a thriving tech firm through sheer brilliance and quiet decency, was finally leaving, and his own children had made a deliberate choice to be absent. I scrolled through the other texts. Marcus, my son, was more succinct, more demanding. He'd sent a photo of a velvet-roped entrance to a nightclub followed by, "Just make sure the lawyer knows to wire the funds for the inheritance ASAP. Dad would want me to use my share to capitalize on this." Not a single word of sorrow. No question about my well-being. Only the unblinking, naked pursuit of money. I looked down at the coffin, shrouded by the single inadequate wreath of white lilies I had placed there. Mr. Finch, the kind-faced undertaker, cleared his throat. He had been so careful, so deferential, but I could see the profound pity in his eyes, the pity for a widow so completely abandoned. "Mrs. Declan, we are ready to proceed. It's just us then." My heart was a heavy, cold stone in my chest. I straightened my black lace veil, taking a moment to internalize the bitter truth. "Yes, Mr. Finch. Just us." As the hired pallbearers, strangers paid for a job my own children should have begged to do, lifted Arthur and carried him out into the miserable drizzle, I followed. Every step down that empty aisle was a hammer blow against my heart, sealing the wound of grief with the iron of pure, justified rage. They thought I was frail. They thought I was broken and easily dismissed. They saw me as the final, tearful obstacle between them and the substantial inheritance. They had misjudged me, and more dangerously, they had misjudged Arthur's final will. I took a deep breath and smiled because there was something my dear daughter didn't know. The funeral was the brutal, undeniable proof of what I had only allowed myself to fear. My children were gone. They were not merely distracted adults. They were hollow reflections of their former selves, having traded duty and love for an insatiable gilded hunger. But their rot hadn't been an overnight epidemic. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning that had sickened Arthur long before his illness ever did. Arthur and I built our lives on a bedrock of thrift, innovation, and partnership. He was a brilliant, self-taught engineer who struck it rich early with a patented security algorithm. We had millions, a beautiful Victorian home, and the kind of financial cushion that should have provided our children with opportunity, not dependency. But that wealth became their curse and eventually Arthur's deep pain. Their entitlement began the moment they realized their lives wouldn't involve struggle. Every college application, every internship, every potential job was merely a stepping stone toward asking for more capital. Minerva, 32, had abandoned 3 different high-concept fashion lines, each failure cushioned by a substantial capital injection from her father, which she spent on exotic travel and VIP access rather than actual inventory. Marcus, 28, convinced Arthur to fund a disruptive social media platform that turned out to be nothing more than a glorified private chat app. The majority of the money going toward leasing an expensive downtown loft and throwing launch parties. Arthur, in his boundless, heartbreaking optimism, always made excuses. "They're entrepreneurial, Eleanor," he'd say, forcing a brave smile. "They just haven't hit the right idea yet." But the hope in his eyes was replaced by a weariness that settled into his bones long before the cancer did. The true pain was in the way they interacted with him. Their visits were always transactional. They'd sit by his bedside only long enough to mention an investment opportunity or a necessary transfer. They never once asked about his health, his memories, or his simple comfort. I remember his 65th birthday just 6 months before he passed. We hosted a quiet dinner. Minerva arrived an hour late, demanding to know why the family chef hadn't prepared a vegan, gluten-free option for her. A dietary restriction she had just started that morning. Marcus was on his phone the entire time, occasionally glancing up to nod vaguely while discussing a new sports car he wanted Arthur to co-sign. Arthur had a coughing fit at the table, a violent spasm that left him gasping for air. Minerva just rolled her eyes and muttered, "Can we just get to the cake? I have to be at the airport." That night, Arthur sat in his study, staring out the window at the rain. He finally admitted the failure that broke him. "They don't see me, Eleanor. They only see the wallet I hold. I didn't raise children. I raised accountants with expensive tastes." His voice was flat, empty of all his former vitality. His final illness was brutal, but it was their casual cruelty that had started chipping away at his will to live years earlier. The day after Arthur's death, the pretend care began. It was a manipulative, sickening shift in their behavior, designed purely to ensure the probate process moved smoothly in their favor. Minerva arrived first, dressed impeccably in black, as if auditioning for the role of the tragic, grieving daughter. She did not hug me. Instead, she took my arm in a firm, almost clinical grip and led me to the kitchen table. "Mom, you look completely lost," she stated, her voice full of false concern. "Don't worry, Marcus and I are here to handle all the difficult decisions. I've already called the estate lawyer and booked a cleaning service for the house. We need to clear out his office ASAP for the appraisal." "I don't need the office cleared out, Minerva. I haven't even gone through his things," I whispered, the grief making me feel faint. "But you will, darling. Eventually. And we need to be proactive. Time is money." She patted my hand once, a brittle, meaningless gesture. "Now about the house. It's beautiful, but frankly, it's a financial drain. I've lined up 3 high-end realtors. We'll get a sale agreement signed within the month. It's for the best. You shouldn't have to worry about maintenance." The hypocrisy was suffocating. They weren't caring for me. They were securing their primary asset by clearing out the evidence of Arthur's life and pushing me into a state of dependent compliance. Marcus's contribution was equally galling. He showed up with a casserole, store-bought of course, and immediately started a conversation about my health regimen. "Mom, you're not eating enough," he'd lecture, circling the kitchen, clearly scouting the place. "You need to stay strong for the paperwork. Look, I bought you a new tablet so you don't miss any critical legal emails. We need you sharp, right? For the Declan estate." He was trying to manage me, to keep me present enough to sign documents but frail enough not to object. The tablet wasn't for entertainment or connection. It was a tool for him to funnel legal documents to me for immediate, unread approval. Their care was a leash, thinly veiled as kindness. They believed they were soothing a simple, grief-stricken old woman, who would be eternally grateful for their efficient, ruthless administration of their own inheritance. The real moment of clarity came at the reading of the will, which I described in the previous act. But the core of the first insult was not just their threat to contest the will. It was the specific provision Arthur had created and their reaction to it. Mr. Mason, the lawyer, read the clause regarding the South Coast property, the $5 million asset they were salivating over. "The deed to the South Coast property shall be transferred 6 months from the date of my passing, provided that, during this time my children Minerva and Marcus Declan have actively and without complaint fulfilled the duties of an heir, namely the respectful and full administration of my final affairs, and the consistent, dutiful and loving care and companionship of my beloved wife Eleanor, whom I charge with the sole and final discretion to certify their compliance." As soon as the words consistent, dutiful and loving care and companionship left the lawyer's lips, Minerva's face became a grotesque mask of fury. 6 months? Of what? Chores? We're not her servants. We have businesses. This is absurd, Mom. You put him up to this, didn't you? You know we need that capital now, and you're using some pathetic emotional test to hold it over us," she screamed, her voice echoing in the lawyer's plush office. Marcus was less volatile but more menacing. "This isn't a will, Mr. Mason. It's undue influence. My mother is clearly incapable of sound judgment right now. We demand a temporary injunction and a review of her competency." The insult wasn't just that they refused the condition. It was their immediate, unblinking leap to declaring me mentally unfit. It showed they viewed the concept of loving care, not as a duty or a privilege, but as an intolerable burden worth destroying their own mother's reputation over. They chose immediate legal warfare rather than 6 months of simple kindness. I sat there, watching them gather their expensive coats and storm out, leaving the lawyer stunned. The image of the empty chapel flashed in my mind. The disrespect shown at his funeral was now escalating to a full-blown assault on his final wishes and my dignity. It was in that moment, sitting silently across from Mr. Mason, that my own inner steel solidified. They wanted a fight? Arthur, through his own brilliant final provision, had given me the perfect weapon. They had just lost the moral high ground and walked directly into the legal tripwire he had set. I would not just defend myself. I would execute Arthur's final perfect justice. The 6 weeks following the will reading were the darkest of my life. My children had gone from being selfish to outright predatory. Their goal was simple: use the delay Arthur had imposed to legally crush me, forcing me to either cave immediately or be declared incompetent. I had to appear defenseless, all while secretly mobilizing the weapon Arthur had provided. Their initial threat to contest the will morphed into a multi-pronged legal/financial move, designed to bleed me dry and undermine my credibility. It started with a barrage of letters from their lawyer. Minerva's counsel, a man named Sterling, initiated proceedings to place a caveat on the sale of my own home. His argument was audacious. Since my judgment was in question regarding the South Coast property, and since the house was the primary asset of my trust, they had a fiduciary duty as concerned heirs to ensure it wasn't mismanaged. This wasn't just about the South Coast land. It was a brazen attempt to immobilize all my assets. They wanted me destitute and unable to afford a proper legal defense. The financial pressure was relentless. They forced an expensive and unnecessary appraisal of the entire estate, demanding I pay the initial costs. They filed formal requests for all my personal bank statements and medical records, citing concern for my financial stability and emotional health post-Arthur's death. Every demand was a veiled insult, calculated to make me feel small, weak, and overwhelmed by paperwork. Marcus, meanwhile, executed a move against the South Coast land itself. He and Minerva, presuming their victory was inevitable, signed a premature option to purchase agreement with the powerful South Coast Development Group, SCDG. This was the most concrete step toward seizing the asset. The contract stipulated a closing date tied to the end of the 6-month probate period, contingent on the removal of all personal encumbrances, meaning me. They were acting as if the property was already theirs, signaling to the world that the old woman was just a technicality soon to be swept aside. The psychological toll was immense. They called my lifelong friends, feigning concern, asking leading questions like, "Have you noticed Mom's memory fading?" And, "Doesn't she seem unusually hostile lately?" They were manufacturing evidence of my instability, systematically eroding the bedrock of my character. I was fighting a war on paper and on reputation, and I was losing ground every day. The loneliness of that funeral was nothing compared to the isolation of this legal siege. I kept my lawyer, Mr. Mason, on the defensive, allowing him to fight small, tactical battles over filing dates and documentation, making my children believe I was reacting emotionally, not strategically. But my real work was hidden, triggered by the discovery that changed everything. I had finally found the emotional strength to enter Arthur's home office. The air was heavy with the ghost of him, the smell of old leather, ink, and his familiar cologne. It was during this mournful task that I found the secret compartment behind the central drawer. Inside was a small, worn, leather-bound book titled Project Phoenix. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew Arthur had been working on a complex project, but he always dismissed it to the children as a hobby right off. The ledger, written in his elegant, meticulous script, detailed the 5-year creation of a revolutionary, encrypted AI data security platform designed for military-grade privacy. It was a masterpiece of code and foresight. He had secretly incorporated the holding company, secured 3 key patents, and funded a small hand-picked team of brilliant young developers. The financial valuation notes were staggering: $200 million pre-launch, with an IPO projected to hit $500 million within the first year. The final entry, scrawled weekly days before his death, was the key to my survival. They never asked, never cared, never listened. Their eyes only tracked the quick, superficial money. Phoenix is the real legacy, and it belongs entirely to Eleanor. She is the founder, the CEO, the sole shareholder of the Eleanor Declan Trust, which controls the holding company. The South Coast land is the bait. If they fail the test of decency, they lose the bait and everything else. My final protection for my wife. The realization hit me with the force of an electric current. Arthur hadn't died leaving me vulnerable. He had died leaving me the helm of a secret corporate giant. He hadn't just given me power. He had given me unassailable truth, a hidden fortune that made the South Coast property look like pocket change. I was no longer a grieving widow defending a $5 million piece of land. I was the silent owner of a $250 million enterprise preparing for global launch, and my children had no idea. My first clandestine meeting was with Arthur's 3 developers. They were stunned but fiercely loyal. They confirmed every detail. The company was ready, the IPO lawyers were in place, and they only needed my final signature to proceed with the launch schedule. They knew nothing about the will dispute, but they agreed to maintain absolute operational silence. My next step was to finally understand the mystery of the land. The ledger contained a tiny, crumpled final codicil to the will, and that small photograph of Arthur smiling beside the old, derelict lighthouse on the South Coast property. The codicil was Arthur's checkmate. If Minerva and Marcus contest the will or move legally against Eleanor Declan's assets or person during the 6-month term, their inheritance of the South Coast property is immediately void, and the land's value shall be used to establish the Arthur Declan Legacy Fund. This meant their legal assault on my competency was exactly what Arthur had anticipated and exactly what would trigger their ruin. But the lighthouse? Why the photo? I hired a specialist in municipal land history, paying him in cash from my personal account. His research unearthed a long-forgotten 50-year-old agreement. Due to its federally protected status, the lighthouse structure was designated a unique communications facility. Arthur, having quietly negotiated the lease years ago, had installed a high-capacity fiber optic transmission hub within the stone shell. It was the only legally designated zoning-exempt data hub in a 100-mile radius, the absolute, non-negotiable nerve center needed for a major tech company, like say Project Phoenix, to launch its global operations. The South Coast property wasn't just $5 million of beachfront. It was the $50 million key to the biggest tech IPO of the year. My children, in their greedy haste, had never bothered to look past the dirt. My preparation became a calculated performance. When Minerva called demanding I drop my ridiculous legal fees, I played the role of the defeated mother. I'm signing the papers, Minerva. I just need a few more days to gather my strength. I lied, my voice weak and worn. I can't fight you anymore. She scoffed, the sound of her triumph grating through the phone. She told Marcus that Mom is finally caving. The trap was fully set. They believed they had won and that I was emotionally broken. They were preparing for a final mediation session to witness my surrender. What they didn't know was that they were walking into the most devastating board meeting of their entire pathetic lives. The showdown was scheduled not in a courtroom, which would have afforded me some procedural defense, but in a private conference room at Mr. Mason's office. This was my children's final arrogant demand, a mediation session designed purely to witness my public and legal surrender. They wanted to see me sign away my rights. Minerva and Marcus arrived late, gliding into the room with their lawyer, Mr. Sterling, trailing behind like a shadow of corporate menace. They were wearing matching custom-tailored power suits. They looked like 2 vultures in expensive plumage, ready to feast. I sat with Mr. Mason, who was visibly anxious, clutching a file of defensive motions. I, however, wore a simple gray dress and a face carefully sculpted into exhaustion and defeat. Mr. Sterling started immediately, his voice smooth and condescending. Mrs. Declan, we appreciate you finally agreeing to this meeting. We believe our temporary injunction against your assets will be approved by the probate judge this afternoon, But my clients are willing to show mercy. Minerva leaned forward, her eyes glittering with cold triumph. Mom, we've decided to be generous. If you sign the release today, transferring the South Coast property into the preliminary trust and relinquishing your care and companionship right, we will drop the motions to review your competency. You keep the house, you keep your personal funds, and we won't testify about your increasing instability. It was a blatant, calculated threat. Sign the papers or they would destroy my reputation and possibly seize all my remaining funds. Marcus chimed in, managing a tone of fake exasperation. Honestly, Mom, all this fighting over 6 months of quality time? It's embarrassing. Dad's will was emotional, not legal. We are correcting his sentimental mistake. We have real capital commitments we need to meet with the SCDG. Mr. Sterling presented his core legal attack. He placed a binder filled with their fabricated evidence on the table. Mrs. Declan, we have sworn affidavits detailing your erratic behavior, your isolation, and your clear failure to properly manage the estate's legal costs. We have documentation from the SCDG that your stubborn delay has already cost the estate over $200,000 in potential liquidated damages. You are holding a $5 million asset hostage based on subjective criteria you are not mentally fit to judge. The law is not on your side, Mrs. Declan. The dialogue was high stakes, ruthless, and entirely focused on minimizing me. They spoke about me, not to me, treating me as a fragile, annoying object that needed to be moved out of the way. They fully dismissed the man who wrote the will and the woman he trusted. The clause was a condition of their inheritance. It was Arthur's dying wish, I said quietly, playing the part of the meek widow. Minerva laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. Daddy wanted us to spend time with you? Fine. Here's your time. One final hour where you sign the papers, and we never have to hear about this ridiculous test again. You wanted us to care? We care about the money that funds our future, not some ancient, useless memory. In that moment, their casual, ingrained cruelty broke through my facade of control, triggering a genuine emotional despair. It was the crushing reality of my failure as a mother, the knowledge that I had raised two people incapable of human empathy. They are truly this cruel. They are winning. Arthur's entire legacy, his love, his last act of faith in me, will be undone by their sheer financial viciousness. The room seemed to shrink. I felt the hot, stinging rush behind my eyes, the threat of tears. My hands trembled exactly as they expected. This was the moment of my seeming defeat, the emotional low point. I needed them to believe the war was over. I reached for the pen and lowered my gaze, a picture of utter defeat. I can't do this anymore. You win. Just give me the papers. I just want it to be done. My voice cracked perfectly, sounding hollow and weak. Minerva and Marcus exchanged a smirk of pure, unadulterated victory. Mr. Sterling nodded in satisfaction and quickly slid the thick packet of documents, the surrender agreement, the transfer of asset forms, the waiver of future claims, across the table toward me. As I picked up the pen, posing for the final devastating signature, Minerva couldn't resist one last vicious flourish. Arrogance had blinded her, and her triumph demanded a final act of superiority. She leaned in, her voice low enough that only I and Marcus could clearly hear. You know, Mom, the SCDG is thrilled. They said the land is perfect for a major resort. We got lucky. If Dad hadn't sold off the company years ago, the value of that land would be tied up in some useless corporate zoning nightmare. But since all that tech nonsense is gone, we can just sell the scrub brush. It's literally just a huge empty piece of dirt, perfect for development. We'll get rid of that ugly old lighthouse too. It's a liability. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, that lighthouse is a worthless antique. Dad should have torn it down years ago. I froze. The pen stopped an inch above the signature line. Ugly. Worthless. Just scrub brush. The fatal mistake was not the legal maneuvering. It was the casual, arrogant dismissal of the one physical object Arthur had been protecting, the lighthouse. The key. I raised my head slowly. The feigned despair vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. The look on my face was one they had never seen. the expression of a cornered executive, not a defeated mother. You're wrong, Minerva. And you're wrong, Marcus. I said, my voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. The land is not just scrub brush. And the lighthouse is not an antique liability. Minerva frowned, confused by my sudden composure. Don't start, Mom. It's over. No, it's not over, I corrected her. It's just beginning. You see, Arthur didn't sell off all his tech nonsense. He sold the first company and quietly started another one. It's called Project Phoenix. It's a $250 million data security firm that is going public tomorrow. Marcus paled. Minerva stammered. What is this madness? It's the truth your father kept hidden from greedy, disloyal children, I stated, my eyes locking on the frightened attorney, Mr. Sterling. And Project Phoenix needs a federally approved, zoning-exempt, high-capacity data transmission hub to launch its international operation. The only one in this region is inside the worthless antique lighthouse on the South Coast property, the property you are currently trying to seize. Their triumph instantly crumbled into dawning, paralyzing horror. The revelation about Project Phoenix and the lighthouse had turned the sterile conference room into a battleground of sheer psychological terror for my children. Their smug confidence was vaporized, replaced by a desperate, sickening scramble for control. A $250 million company? That's impossible. Dad's finances were an open book. Minerva shrieked, her voice high and unstable. She grabbed the shoulder of her lawyer, Mr. Sterling. This is a fabrication. You have to stop her. Mr. Sterling, the aggressive shark, looked utterly gutted. He turned to Mr. Mason, demanding answers. Mason, is this true? Was a significant corporate entity structured outside the primary will? Mr. Mason, my loyal, long-suffering attorney, finally found his voice, bolstered by the truth. Mr. Sterling, Project Phoenix was structured as a separate corporate entity years ago, primarily funded through a private trust. The sole beneficiary and controlling director is the Eleanor Declan Trust, a trust that has, for years, managed the majority of Mrs. Declan's personal wealth, which you were too dismissive to investigate. I didn't let them recover. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, crumpled final codicil and the faded photograph of Arthur by the lighthouse. This codicil, I announced, placing it next to the documents they wanted me to sign, states that any legal action taken by you, Minerva and Marcus Declan, against my personal assets or my status as executor, immediately voids your inheritance of the South Coast property. By filing that motion this morning to declare me incompetent and seizing the assets of my trust, you have done exactly that. You triggered the clause. I looked at Minerva, whose carefully applied makeup was starting to run from shock. You were too arrogant to perform due diligence. You were too consumed by greed to pause for 6 months of kindness. You saw a piece of dirt worth $5 million. Your father saw an irreplaceable $50 million infrastructure asset, the linchpin for his true legacy, Project Phoenix. I pointed to the photo of the lighthouse. Arthur negotiated the lease for the communications hub years ago, knowing the SCDG would never be able to build on that land without buying him out first. The value of the property isn't the resort potential. It's the monopoly on data transfer it holds. And since you voided your claim, the property does not revert to the main estate. It reverts to the Arthur Declan Legacy Fund, which will now use the SCDG's massive purchase offer to fund scholarships for ethical tech development. Marcus, realizing the depth of the loss, let out a choked sound of pure despair. The fund? So we get nothing? Not even the profit from the sale? No, I stated firmly. You get the satisfaction of knowing that your greed funded a charitable foundation that will teach young people the decency you never learned. You chose to fight me, and Arthur's will, which he made unassailable, has disinherited you completely from the only asset you cared about. The ensuing scene of the antagonist's collapse was sickeningly gratifying. Minerva slammed her hands on the table, her facade completely destroyed. You lied to us. You faked being frail. You sat there while we filed motions. You let us do this. She was screaming now, tears of rage and disbelief streaming down her face. This is an old woman's spite. You're ruined us. We're financially destroyed. You ruined yourselves, I countered, standing my ground. I simply executed your father's final instructions. He gave you a test of character, and you ran straight for the fire. Mr. Sterling, visibly panicked about his own professional liability, gathered his papers and whispered furiously to my children. He was demanding to know why they hadn't informed him about a possible codicil, or the true purpose of the lighthouse. He quickly realized he had been working for two clients who were not only lying to their mother but also lying to him. He practically ran for the door. Marcus's collapse was quieter, colder. He stared at the Project Phoenix ledger I had just pulled out. A simple worn book that represented hundreds of millions of dollars he would never see. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost frightening. You knew, he breathed. You knew the whole time. You let us embarrass ourselves at the funeral. You let us sign contracts we can't fulfill. You are colder than we ever were, Mom. Perhaps, I conceded, meeting his hatred without flinching. But my coldness is rooted in your disloyalty to the only man who ever truly loved you. Your coldness is rooted in entitlement. One is righteous, the other is ruinous. I delivered the final blow. And because you filed that motion to declare me mentally unfit, that action is now on the public record. You attacked the CEO of a major corporation a day before her IPO. The judge will not look kindly on you, Marcus. And I promise you neither will the press. When Project Phoenix launches tomorrow, so will the story of the entitled children who sued their grieving mother and lost the family fortune. Minerva began to wail, a desperate sound of financial bereavement. She stumbled back, knocking a chair over, and then fled the room, heedless of her expensive clothes or dignity. Marcus stared at the signed option to purchase on the South Coast land, a contract he now couldn't deliver, and then walked out without a word, slamming the door on his legacy forever. The immediate fallout was total. Mr. Mason immediately filed the codicil with the probate court, along with a detailed accounting of Minerva and Marcus's legal actions against me. The judge, presented with irrefutable evidence that the children had launched a malicious and frivolous assault on the executor, not only ratified the codicil, voiding their inheritance, but also hit them with significant legal consequences. They were ordered to pay all my legal fees associated with defending the motion to remove me. Furthermore, they had signed a binding contract with the SCE to sell the land, a contract they could now not honor because the land belonged to the newly formed Arthur Declan Legacy Fund. This led to a massive, immediate breach of contract, resulting in crippling fines and liquidated damages that effectively wiped out whatever small personal savings or assets they had left. They didn't just lose the $50 million land. They were left with a public record of their financial and moral ruin, owing significant legal and corporate debt. The money they coveted was gone, used to build a foundation in the name of the man they abandoned. I was left with the house, my dignity restored, and Project Phoenix, a multi-billion-dollar empire built on the bedrock of Arthur's love and my strategic execution of his final, perfect revenge. The weeks following the reversal were a dizzying blur of corporate success and quiet, personal restoration. Project Phoenix launched with immediate, spectacular results, its IPO shattering expectations. I had transformed overnight from the abandoned widow into the savvy, silent CEO, a role Arthur had prepared me for all along. The legal battle was over, and the emotional battle had finally been won. The relentless siege of my children's greed had lifted, leaving behind a profound, sunlit peace. I didn't keep the corporate corner office. Instead, I established the foundation's headquarters in a wing of the Victorian home Arthur and I shared. The house, once a source of bitter dispute, was now a vibrant hub of purpose and optimism. I oversaw the Arthur Declan Legacy Fund, which quickly became a major backer of ethical technology and sustainable development, the very things Arthur cared about most. My life became beautifully, purposefully quiet. I sold the expensive cars and the unnecessary jewelry. I donated the proceeds to the fund. I purchased a small high-speed sailboat, a passion Arthur and I shared, and spent weekends on the open water. I found a new authentic form of companionship, the fierce loyalty of the Project Phoenix developers, the respectful dedication of my foundation staff, and the renewed bond with Mr. Mason, who became my trusted advisor and friend. I wasn't grieving a lost future. I was celebrating a new one, built on the solid foundation of my own restored dignity. Arthur had given me not just money, but the fierce self-worth that comes from executing a complex, perfect plan. The loneliness of that funeral was finally replaced by the warmth of belonging, to a purpose, to a legacy, and to myself. The world is vast enough that one should never have to encounter ghosts, but in a small city, destiny often forces a final glance. My only contact with Minerva and Marcus was through increasingly desperate, erratic emails, which were all filtered directly into my attorney's spam folder. They ranged from pathetic requests for small loans to blistering, hateful screeds where they blamed me for their downfall. The final sight occurred on a crisp Saturday afternoon. I was leaving a small independent coffee shop after a meeting with a scholarship recipient. I saw Marcus first. He was working across the street, wearing a faded, cheap uniform, holding a cardboard sign advertising a local mobile service provider. He looked years older, haggard, and utterly devoid of the expensive polish that had once defined him. When he saw me, dressed simply but with an air of absolute, unassailable financial freedom, his face twisted. It was a look of pure, impotent rage and crushing regret. He turned away abruptly, hiding his face behind the sign, unable to meet my eyes. A week later, I saw Minerva on the local evening news. She was being interviewed near a small foreclosed property she had apparently tried, and failed, to purchase with borrowed funds. She was railing against corporate conspiracy and the unjust legal system. She looked thin, angry, and utterly consumed by her victimhood. She still wore the expensive remnants of her former life, a designer jacket now stained and worn, but the light behind her eyes was dead. She had lost everything, but worse, she had learned nothing. They had chosen the fleeting pleasure of parties over their father's goodbye, and in doing so, they had forfeited the very means of having a future. I paused at the door of my beautiful, quiet home, watching the sunset cast long shadows over Arthur's favorite rose garden. I finally spoke the truth I had lived. When you confuse simple human decency with a transactional burden, you forfeit the only legacy truly worth inheriting: character.